I live with, as we all do, a blessing and a challenge, and they come all pretty much always from the same place. And for me, it's that I can hardly ever give the same Dharma talk in the way I've previously written it. I don't know what it is. So that's the challenge. The blessing is that often you hear something new, but it's just been thought about and jotted a couple of hours beforehand. So sometimes it isn't always comprehensive, sometimes it doesn't flow. When it does, Ian is the first one to tell me, that one flowed. So it's just like going to the fair, you don't know what ride you're going to get on. And we'll see. When I first came here in 1979, I would cry and cry. I cried and cried and cried. I went to that yucca tree. If you cross the road, Winters Road, there's a yucca tree, a big yucca tree that has stones around it. I don't know if it still does. And I would just walk to that tree and sit under it and cry and cry. And I understand why. Because when we first come on retreat, or even just when we come on any retreat, the grief that we carry, and it's not just from even this time, but generations of grief, is uncovered and opened up. And so there are times when it might be that we just cry and cry and cry, and that it isn't anything other than this acknowledgement of how much as human beings we hold. You know, when I think of my own lineage, I think of my great-grandmother who killed herself. I think of the pogroms that she came from, and then the only place they could find to live in was like the middle of South Africa in the Transkei, which was very desert. There were no other Jews there. She was totally isolated. And how that got passed on to my grandmother, who often was very depressed. And that is just one part of what they say people now is carried in our genes, that it's carried generationally, the grief. And the grief of each of us growing up in our families or going to schools where we weren't able to grow up in innocence, like the grief of losing safety, the grief of living in violence, the grief of having to be older or to lose childhood and become an adult when we weren't ready. The grief of being lost when there was so much suffering and not being able to understand it. And when, and I think her name was Rachel, and so when someone dies, sometimes one death can open up that ocean of grief that we carry. And that reason for it that sometimes there's so much grief that we just have to orient our life towards holding it. We can't do anything else. And so we cry and we acknowledge that this grief isn't just a personal grief, but it's all our grief. And the Buddha said that during the eons of human beings being alive, that we've carried so much grief that our tears have filled all the oceans 4 times over. So that's another way of saying that it's not individual, that we all together are carrying the grief of living in cultures that are wounded and far from the expression of kindness and well-being. And we know sometimes in our daily lives how hard it is to undefend our hearts, because we have to interact and work and get on public transportation or drive on a freeway or whatever it is. We have children, or we're caring for parents. Am I speaking loud enough? No, quiet. Taking care of our parents. Would it help to have this closer? Do you think? I don't know. Let's try it and see if it helps to have it closer. Thanks, Reed. And so when we come on retreat, not every time, but sometimes there are moments or times that we create the space as a community to honor that grief, to allow it in tears, to give expression to it. The beauty of this practice is that mindfulness and loving kindness build the banks that hold our rivers of grief, so that we actually have a way to step in and step out. So we don't need to keep defended because we're scared that we're going to be overwhelmed by our grief. And it can be as simple as trusting that when that grief feels overwhelming, just stepping, here, now, my body, my foot, placing, lifting, placing. Sometimes that's enough to build a bridge back to the banks, to rest on dry ground. And it feels sometimes, when I am sharing the Dharma, that I'm talking or speaking textually sometimes, and sometimes I'm speaking directly from experience. There have been so many times when I have relied on stepping, or tapping. This is my arm. I'm here and now. That practice that we're doing is the practice that builds the bank, that enables us to step onto ground and to reconnect. And so we have been quoting the Buddha's invitation to us around the incredible strength of mindfulness in its capacity to give us ground and to create a safe refuge for us. Because if we don't feel we have a safe refuge, then it becomes too scary to open up. And so it's good to acknowledge that refuge and to know it and to try it on and to find for yourself. It might not be stepping for you, it might be something else. It might be singing of what your ground is that you can come back to as your refuge. And then there's another refuge that's a ground, and that is another refuge and another lineage of expression in our lives. And one is the woundedness that we carry, and the other is the amazing capacity, the miraculous capacity we have to feel beautiful, to feel alive in delight. Those moments when we feel almost like we're dewdrops with the sun striking on us, like rainbows of color. And maybe that comes in moments of dancing or painting or singing or in practice and meditation. What that communicates to us is that we also have this other inheritance, and that we have both. And that so much about this practice is holding both and learning how to lift one in particularly or open to the other, and not to forget that both are our heritage. There is this, and this heritage is I talk about it a lot when I talk about cultivating joy, how hard it is for us to claim our own beauty, to know that each one of us are exquisite in ways that will never be repeated again. The combination of our generosity or our kindness or our particular sense of humor or our courage or our endurance or our commitment, they come in ways that are absolutely unique. And part of this practice is about learning to discern and acknowledge that in ways in which it becomes an ongoing reality and part of this bank. So there is this, I love to read this, this sharing. I tell you, I would have died but for the friendships. The doctors had just about given up. Forget it for having any will to live. I can't begin to describe the despair. Beyond the relentless physical pain, there was this utter emptiness of heart and soul. Each morning felt like waking up in hell. Can you understand that? Every morning feeling that way, like it was the first time. And yet, people came and called and cared and stayed. And each gesture came to feel almost miraculous to me. There were moments when I would say, "You just don't know what this means to me." and they didn't. They couldn't or wouldn't. Isn't that wild? They really didn't see it. They didn't recognize how much their ordinary expressions of love would do for me. On the other hand, I thought it was wonderful. They wouldn't make a big deal out of something that seemed so simple for them, just showing up. But on the other hand, I wanted to shake them and say, do you know how beautiful you are? Won't you see it? As if they were angels who had forgotten. And I feel that. I feel like sometimes I'm an angel, an extremely imperfect one. If you happen to live here, you know. There's so many times I end up saying sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. Because I'm so imperfect. And yet, I believe that inside of our hearts is this understanding that this is also true, that we are beautiful, each one of us, beyond measure, and we are learning to reclaim that. And that there's something about a retreat and being in silence, even online, where something like that gets lifted up, so that I can sit in front of you and feel that, see that you are beautiful, and that you, I know at times, see me in that way. And so we're also on this path to reclaim that. And I don't mean beautiful like how we look or what we wear. I mean beautiful in the ways those beautiful energies that define a Buddha as a Buddha live inside of us as well. Because our generosity and our love and our willingness to speak the truth, even if we are learning and bumping along clunkily in that, and our capacity to forgive, even if we are learning and clunky in that the seed of it is the same as the Buddha's. That the Buddha became a Buddha because somewhere there was that willingness, the same willingness we have to say, no, I refuse to believe that I'm less than that. Even when there are times when I forget. I refuse to keep forgetting. So here is Audre Lorde, who is up there as one of our ancestors, who it was so amazing. Oh, I'm just jumping the gun a little bit. So one of the practices that supports this, learning to open to who we really are, is the practice of loving kindness. That's the bridge. So this is what Audre says. I have to learn to love myself before I can love you or accept your loving. You have to learn to love yourself before you can love me or accept my loving. Know we are worthy of touch before we can reach out for each other. Not cover that sense of worthlessness with, I don't want you, or it doesn't matter. And these are enormously difficult to accomplish in an environment that consistently encourages non-love and cover-up. An environment that warns us to be quiet about our need of each other by defining our dissatisfactions as unanswerable and our necessities as unobtainable. We have to consciously study how to be tender with each other until it becomes a habit, because what was native has been stolen from us, the love of Black women for each other. But we can practice being gentle with ourselves by being gentle with each other. We can practice being gentle with each other by being gentle with that piece of ourselves that is hardest to hold. By giving more to the brave, bruised child within each of us. By expecting a little less from their gargantuan effort to excel. We can love in the light as well as in the darkness. Quiet the frenzy towards perfection and encourage our attentions towards fulfillment. It would be ridiculous to believe that this process is not lengthy and difficult. It is suicidal to believe it is not possible. As we arm ourselves with ourselves and each other, we can stand toe to toe inside that rigorous loving and begin to speak the impossible, or what has always seemed like the impossible, to one another. The first step towards genuine change eventually, if we speak the truth to each other, will become unavoidable to ourselves. That comes from Sister Outsider. So when I first heard the practice of loving kindness, it wasn't sort of contextualized in this way, and I couldn't do it. The phrases seemed false, and I didn't know who I was doing it to, because who I was doing it to was so shut down and defended. It just felt like everything was bouncing off. And I have enormous respect for all my teachers, but they never told me that I was beautiful, that there was a living part inside of me that could grow, and that's what the practice of loving kindness is about. It is about that willingness to believe that inside of us is this capacity and that we can grow it. And then there are these multitudes of ways that we can grow it. And the first is really taking a lot of time to contemplate our generosity, our non-harming, our truthfulness, and our caring and compassion for ourselves and for others. That's the ground for loving kindness to grow. To every time we do something as simple, and I lift this up every retreat, that you open the door for someone else, or wait for someone to walk through, or allow us teachers and others to step in line in front of the at the front of the line for meals, or offer help in some other way. Every time we do that, don't dismiss it. Like, turn towards it and acknowledge it and appreciate that. Every single time you have a thought of caring, oh, I've forgotten to write to this person, like, appreciate it. Because the reality is not that we're horrible. The reality is that we've forgotten to turn to what's beautiful. And that's the ground and the basis for loving kindness. And once there's that acknowledgement and connection, then it becomes so much easier to begin to offer kindness and caring to ourselves, because our hearts have been supported and nourished in their opening through the acknowledgement of the beautiful qualities. One of the single biggest contributions to creating the ground for loving kindness is to challenge the judgment, blame, and shame that we carry about ourselves. And that's going back to Ian's wonderful Dharma talk last night, of beginning to look, and this is where the invitation of U Pandita in his description of mindfulness was so helpful, to turn towards and confront directly those places inside of ourselves, the shame, blame, and judgment, and to call in the faith that never ever is there truth or wisdom in any faith, in any blame, judgment, in any shame, in any negative quality turned towards ourselves, that it never ever is justified, even when we make a terrible mistake. Even when we want to cringe because we feel we deserve it, we actually never do. And this reclaiming our beauty rests on us being willing to challenge the cultural conditioning and the generational conditioning that used blame and shame as a defense for survival. And the way that we do it is by being present enough, aware enough, and in a way confrontative enough to say, there I see you. And even if you have a grip on me at the moment, I know you're not true. And that dismantling of it begins with that understanding that the thoughts associated with those energies are never true. Just never. So the Buddha gave a description of walking around with he didn't call it blame or shame, but negative thinking. He said it was like wearing a necklace of shit. All it does was stink. You know, and that is what those energies are like. All they do is stink. There's never any wholesomeness to it or healing to it. And it is a journey, isn't it? It's a journey to keep disentangling from those defense mechanisms because they were once how we survived. If that's what's happening to me, it must be because there's something wrong with me. But there isn't anything wrong with us. we have a lot to learn, but that's a whole different path. It's a path of caring and openness, not a path of judgment. So the willingness to become warriors, to kind of like the Buddha, to touch the earth, to call on the Buddha called on the earth and said, "You are my witness." And I do this sometimes. "You are my witness. I refuse to continue to believe this thought. I refuse to align with self-hatred or self-judgment or self-blame or self-shame." And I call on the earth, and I call on the lineage, and I call on the strength and courage of my ancestors to bear witness to this commitment. That's one of the most beautiful gifts we can give ourselves, is that commitment and the practice of staying with the breath and of walking and of knowing when you're brushing your teeth and knowing when you're putting on clothes and knowing when you're taking them off and knowing when you're pulling the paper off the toilet roll is the sword, is the strength that enables us to cut through the negative conditioning. And it's done with love. And so we cultivate intentionally mindfulness and loving kindness to help in the disentangling from our cultural conditionings of oppression. So then this is what Adrian Rich says. "So much has been destroyed. I have cast my lot with those who age after age, perversely with no extraordinary power, work on reconstituting the world." There is the story of a monastery that was really in hard times. There were only 5 older, what they call themselves, monks or something else in the Christian tradition. Monks. And things were in disrepair and ruin, and the head monk, the abbot, decided to go and visit a rabbi who had a hut nearby. And he went to visit the rabbi and said, "You know, I'm just feeling really depressed about the state of affairs, that we're all old, the monastery is in disrepair, and no one's staying with us." And the rabbi said, "I know, I don't know what's happening in the world. It's really a sad state." And they drank tea and commiserated with each other. And so the abbot started to take his leave and said, "So do you have any wise words of wisdom for me, dear rabbi?" And the rabbi said, "You know I don't, but I do suspect one of you is it wasn't a reincarnation of Jesus, but one of you is the Savior, something like that." And so the abbot goes back and shares this with the monks. And so one monk, John, says, "I wonder if the abbot is the Savior, and I'm so sorry, I can't remember the exact word, but it's the Savior. He's been so caring of us. But then maybe it's Brother Richard. Brother Richard is so wise. And I know he's grumpy at times, but he really does seem to offer us the best advice when we need it. And then someone else was thinking, yeah, maybe it's Brother Jack, because Brother Jack is you know, always there when we need someone. So as they begin to consider each other as the possible Savior, they start really caring for each other and respecting each other in new ways. And the energy in the monastery changes. And so there happens someone who was walking in the forest who stumbled on the monastery, into the monastery lost, and was like, oh wow, this place feels kind of good, and went back to his family and said, you know, I just discovered this monastery and there are these 5 old monks there, but it's really good energy. We should go and visit. And so the word spread around that this was a good place to come and visit, and someone came to visit and said, hey, I'm really ready to come into the training. And over the years, the monastery was rejuvenated. So I love this story because it was this incredible willingness to believe that each of the monks could possibly have been the Savior, as each of us are saviors in our own ways. Just whatever and however we live, whatever we do is a contribution to that. And how amazing it would be if we were willing to open up enough to relate to each other in that way. So, let's see if there's one more story. This is a coming full circle to holding everything. I used to have to walk through it automatically. You don't bother to look. You certainly don't let much of it in. But it was the children themselves who began to open me up. Once it started, it began to pull me in gradually but steadily. It was very powerful, but you have to take it in at your own pace, because here in a neonatal intensive care unit, you see incredible beauty and unbearable pain. And you have to figure out how to be with both. The children are beautiful because you just get to know them. You can't nurse them, really nurse them, without knowing them. And you can't know them, really know them, without seeing their beauty. Part of it seems to come from how fragile they are, how uncertain it is how long they'll be here. The cliché metaphor of the flower that blooms for a day. It's like a garden of that in here. The picture on the surface, though, is also terribly grim. A room full of these little ones, many of whom are right on the edge of life and death, and some of whose faces and movements are pretty distressing. And then their parents, there on the other side of the window, with the most desperate and stricken faces looking in, so helplessly in such pain. It was the use of machines and extraordinary medical measures that moved several of us to see how much distance we were putting between ourselves and the infants. Even if the machines weren't there, there was that tendency to keep it impersonal, to keep your distance, and you knew that wasn't any good for the children least of all. So a group of us began to talk about it, to open up to our feelings, to decide to be with the children more. And when it got too hard and would break down, we'd support each other and talk it over. The more we opened up, it just became natural that we began a new practice of holding infants when the time would come for them to die. It wasn't a decision as much as something we'd become ready to do. So at the end, we'd take them off the monitors and into our arms in a rocker, and we'd sit with them there in their final moments. It tears you apart, because holding them, sometimes you can feel them go. And the death itself is different. On the machines, it's monitored as brain death. In your arms, it's the heart and the breath. It's so, what's the word, poignant. You feel 10 dozen things at once. Terrible sadness, because you've become attached to the child. But glad too, because their suffering is about to end. Maybe anger at the world, at God, at whatever, for allowing this to happen. And such empathy for the parents. And something like awe and wonder, like there must be some kind of explanation for all this, which you don't understand yet. But patience too, that things will become clearer in time. And peace of mind, because you're doing the best you can. And humble to be present at such a moment. All of the above, often at once. You're sitting with these feelings as well as sitting there with the child. In fact, you come to see that you're sitting with all of it on behalf of the child. You're doing it for yourself, and you're doing it because it's a final act for them as well. You're offering whatever peace you've come to, and it creates such intimacy, impossible to describe. So let's take a moment.